John Jay was born on December 12, 1745 in New York City, New York. Spent most of his childhood nearby Ray, New York, to Peter Jay and Mary Van Cortlandt, to one of their 10 children. After being educated by his mother at home until he was about 8 years old, he was sent to New Rochelle to study under Anglican priests. He returned home after 3 years and continued his education under his mother and George Murray. He joined King's College in 1760 and met many people during this period who would greatly influence his thinking. He graduated with the highest honors in 1764. He proceeded to study law under Benjamin Kissam, a lawyer and a politician, and completed his legal studies in 1768, following which he was admitted to the bar of New York. John Jay married Sarah Van Berg Livingston, eldest daughter of the New Jersey Governor William Livingston, and his wife in 1774. Jay represented New York at the Continental Congress in 1774. In 1776, Jay went back to New York after working as the state's Chief Justice and helping to write the state constitution. He returned to the Continental Congress in 1778. In 1789, George Washington appointed Jay as the Supreme Court's first Chief Justice, a role he held until 1795. In 1801, Jay stepped away from public life to retire to his farm in Bedford, New York. He died at his farm on May 17, 1829, at the age of 83.
The case of Powell v. Alabama was a landmark trial heard by the United States Supreme Court. The case ultimately determined that in a capital legal trial, the defending party is always awarded access to a lawyer if he or she requests one. Defendants in all capital cases are awarded this right because of due process clause of the United States Constitution. The case of Powell v. Alabama begins with the events that occurred in spring 1931. During this time, 9 African American boys were accused of raping 2 young white girls named Victoria Price and Ruby Bates. The boys, who were called the Scottsboro Boys, were traveling on a train with 9 white people. A fight between the two sides broke out, and all but one of the white males was thrown from the moving train. The white women on board then accused the African American boys of raping them. However, after the initial claim, one woman went back on this statement and said the boys did not touch the girls. Each of the defendants, except for one boy, was sentenced to death in a series of quick and careless trials. In Powell v. Alabama, the United States Supreme Court reversed the original rulings made by the state courts. The United States Supreme Court in Powell v. Alabama found that the state had violated the boys' constitutional rights by not allowing them to discuss the case with their lawyers. These rights, which are awarded in due process clause of the United States Constitution, must be awarded to every citizen of the United States. Because the boys were not given a fair trial and were denied the right to speak with their lawyers, their charges were dropped and they were able to walk free. Powell v. Alabama was heard on October 10th of 1932. The case was decided on November 7th of the same year. In the 1930s, the reign of Jim Crow had reached its apex in the South. Segregation of the races remained the norm across the region and indeed across the nation. Discrimination exacerbated by devastating effects of the Great Depression was partially harsh. A new Ku Klux Klan had arisen in the 1920s, marauding the nation with intimidation and terror. Social attitudes among white people in the South reflected a desire to keep the races separate, to be sure, but far from equal, according to the Plancy standard. Few African Americans voted, held public office, or even spoke publicly about abuses in the South. The Scottsboro trials were a travesty of justice, the accused having been railroaded through a discriminatory system. The young black man's right to counsel was so fundamental to criminal proceedings that any trial conducted with a defense attorney was not a fair trial at all. Alabama's conduct of the trial was unfair, a violation of basic rule of decency and justice under the Constitution. Justice demanded that the death sentences be overturned and that new trials would be ordered. The right to a legal counsel, as stated in the Sixth Amendment, applies only to federal courts. Each state conducts its own criminal justice system, separate from federal authority, under the reserved powers of the Constitution. Alabama has its own Bill of Rights that recognizes the right of accused to obtain counsel, but does not require the state to pay for attorneys to defend accused persons. The Supreme Court should not interfere with the internal operation of state courts and had never done so in 140 years. Moreover, an attorney defended the accused, but they were all convicted.